louder for the people in the back. Who are you creating that alternate version for?
Yourself.
Yourself. And that becomes dangerous. And I really mean that genuinely. I mean it's dangerous. If you're a person who comes along and think about something that you would condemn somebody else for, or some view that you would project that you don't really hold, but you project a view because I don't know, you're supposed to, whatever that means. You don't want to get called out. You don't want to get doxxed or canceled or whatever. So we'll project certain views. The problem with this is it's not just that you're inauthentic, which by the way is a really big problem. You know what I mean by this? To be authentic versus to be inauthentic.
Accurate?
Yeah, exactly. It's to be beyond just, it's to be beyond just, real. Like we'll say, you have to be real. I don't know. Besides, what does this even mean? So now what ends up happening is you can think of a view that you might have. I mean, I don't know how specific I'll get right now, but even something like this, like you condemn another person for like you're saying, like cheating on a boyfriend or cheating on a girlfriend, and now you suddenly adopt that view and you're very vocal about it. I would never. We should condemn all people who do this. And what ends up happening is that you start to adopt this view that you don't really hold yourself. But now, because you've projected that out into the world, you now almost like psychologically now you have to force yourself to start seeing the world that way, and through some action that you condemn. And of course, if you condemn some action in others and in the world, then you privately hold it. Well, there's a lot of problems that are going to go along with this. I've talked before about how you have these kind of aspects of yourself, the persona that you show the world. This is the face that you show the world. When you guys come in here and I ask you guys, good morning, and then you respond and you say, one of you may respond and say good morning, and then I ask how you're doing, and I'll hear like these mumbles, fine. If a person's fine, do they mumble out? Fine.
No.
Do they murmur out? Good. No, but we do it anyway, because that's the face that we think we're expected to show the world. And the reason I ask you that is I'm trying to get like a pulse on the class in the morning to see how everybody is doing. You can tell by the kind of response to see what kind of energy comes back. And it's interesting to me, I'll ask that, like, how is everyone? They're going, fine. And then people will complain later, oh my God, the class is so boring. Can't even respond with something, but the class is boring. It's not you who's so low energy and can't even be polite enough to respond to a person who asks you a question. You can't do the thing that you, hopefully you'd expect of your own children to do something like that. But the problem is in the class, not in you, right? Mm-hmm. We should read something about that someday, about the importance of fixing yourself before you're expecting the rest of the world to be fixed around you. I'm going to put that on my list of things to read someday. Yeah.
So it's like similar to like certain posts when people like, oh, I'm fine, and it shows like a mask like over their face, like it's a smiley face, but under it you just see the tears, and they're actually feeling very sad about them.
Yeah.
About them. It's like,
yeah. And that makes it worse. That makes it worse, by the way. I'm not saying that if you're not doing well, you should walk around and be a crying wreck, because there is something to be said about putting forth an honest face. Like if you're in a bad mood, should you pretend like you're in a good mood? Probably, because it isn't the fault of anybody that you're interacting with here that you're in a bad mood. If you fill in the blank of whatever put you in a bad mood that day, I'm going to bet that it wasn't somebody in here. It wasn't probably somebody that you interacted with when you got here and walked over here. And yet when we're in a bad mood, sometimes we now project it onto everybody else, like, I'm just in a bad mood. So if all of us were in a bad, think about this, if all of us who were in a bad mood one day just came in and acted out in that way, God, what would the world look like? We could say it's extremely narcissistic to act out your emotions, perhaps. But there's also something to be said about this persona that we project out into the world, and then that shadow thing that's underneath it, and that would be like the tears, you might say, that are underneath the mask. So we project the mask, we have this shadow that's underneath. The shadow is the part of you that you hide from the world. It doesn't have to necessarily be negative things. It can't just, think about like your worst desires and the worst things you think about. It doesn't have to just be those things. It could also be sadness. It could also be embarrassment. It could also be shame. All of the things that you hide from the world. The problem, though, is that when you try to suppress this stuff, eventually it just explodes out, and it does come through. And these are the like the emotional, I guess, acting outs that we might say.
That's an emotional roller coaster.
Yeah, and you see this kind of reflected in like in movies, comic books. You think about like Batman.
Batman. Oh yeah, Batman.
Yeah, Batman's got a persona. The interesting question is Batman's persona Bruce Wayne or is it Batman? Which is the real him? That's it is completely opposite in every regard. If you look at someone like Bruce Wayne, yeah, he inherits the company, but then he builds it.
Yeah.
Because he's somebody who builds things. That's what a positive personality does. It builds things. Yep. What does the negative personality do? Well, it destroys things.
Yeah.
It's like if you're there are people who are the class clown, and if you're the class clown, you have a significant responsibility. You may not even realize it, but you think about like a comedian. What's a comedian's job?
Make people laugh.
Okay, that's the comedian's job. But what's the comedian's job?
Comedian's job?
In other words, they make people laugh. True.
Entertain.
They make people laugh. True.
Oh.
But they do it in a very specific way. They tell the truth. It's the truth that makes you laugh. If a comedian, like whenever someone will, like I have a student who like clutch their pearls and make a joke in class and go, "That's not funny." I always ask the question, "Tell me something funny. Tell me a joke." Well, that's not funny. Fine. So you're an expert in comedy. Tell me a joke. Tell me something funny. The whole class wants to hear you say something funny. Let's hear it. Now, can that person ever say something funny? No, of course not, because they're on the spot. I mean, I understand that. But also, it's because it's probably a person who doesn't have much of a sense of humor at all. They're really good at tearing down things. Just like the Joker is really good at tearing something down. In terms of actually building something and making something, well, that's damn near impossible for personalities like that. People who find everything to be problematic, or they problematize, to use another invented term of the day. So this is the tendency of the shadow, to tear down, the persona to build up. And the persona doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with you. It isn't like, oh, that's fake. No, it's not fake. It's an aspect of who you are. Just like the persona, just like the shadow is an aspect of who you are. And this is what you're going to find is one of the things that leads to a lot of mental illness in people, because they can't reconcile this persona and this shadow. There are these parts of yourself that you don't want to admit. There are these parts of yourself that you embellish because we want to show those positive things to the world. But you want to suppress those other sides of you. And so you try to push them down. But like I said, as soon as you say, "I would never," get ready. It's probably going to bubble up at some point. You're probably going to do it. So how do you do it? Well, you have to integrate the shadow and the persona. You have to put those two things together. When there's some kind of a dark desire that you have, or something, you ever have that, I'm trying to think as well, I can think of something horrible. I wonder how many of you have ever sat in a class and thought about shooting the place up. Yeah, exactly. Good, some honest people. You know, but that's important, because I know that many of you have had that. I'm not worried about these guys who said, "Yeah, I thought about it." I'm worried about the person who sat there and said, "No, Scanlon, never once have I thought about it." That's the person who creeps me out. Because that's the person who's, because if you've thought about it, what you've also probably considered is how bad of an idea it would be. On lots of different levels. On lots of different levels. Not only that will be second semester. But my point is that if there's something that you consider that you feel like, "I shouldn't do this, this is bad, society frowns on this," or even just, "I find this personally reprehensible," don't suppress it. You have to invite it in. It's like if you're struggling with depression. Hello. I don't know. I will find out.
Thank you so much.
Of course. If there's something that's like depression. If depression comes, what should you do? Should you just try to cover it up and go, "I'm thinking too much. I have to go out and do something." Then you go out and you hang out and do something.
Mechanism.
What's that?
Just become emo.
Just what?
Just become emo.
Just become emo?
Yeah.
Oh, then you have to listen to shitty music.
Oh. Cope. Find a cope mechanism.
Tell them the truth, or doesn't mean you can't. By the way, just because something's shitty doesn't mean you can't like it.
It's bad.
Yeah, it's like I'm sure some of you guys pretend to like reggae. Reggae's. Yeah, I'm sorry, reggae sells. Everyone's afraid to say it. No one likes reggae, dude. Come on, no one likes reggae.
What is
you have to get high to like it. That's why you have to smoke so much weed, and you're like, "Oh, I guess it's okay." And then people are like, "Well, you'll tell me, all right, reggae sucks." "Oh, it's because you don't feel it." No, I do feel it, man. I feel it. It makes me sick. But everyone's afraid to say it. it's the emperor's new clothes. Everyone's just afraid to say like, it sucks. But you're in a safe space. You can acknowledge that reggae sucks and that soccer is not a real sport. Yeah, sure. But I think last year I had a student in the class, and I had a student last year in the class, and she was very well spoken in all the things you're supposed to say, all the jargon. And she gave a long talk about patriarchy and toxic masculinity. And when she very well spoken, when she got done, I asked her to explain what that, to articulate exactly what that was. And the only thing that she was able to articulate in terms of about toxic masculinity was essentially just masculinity. That's all she, in other words, she had no distinction between what was toxic and what was healthy. And then when I asked her to explain what toxic femininity was, she froze and she said, I've never thought about that. And I said, it's worth thinking about. Because if you have toxicity on one side, then you obviously are going to have toxicity on the other side. And maybe the problem is not so, well, maybe the problem is that there's something wrong with the other side, but also maybe there's something wrong with our side as well. In other words, if we're being toxic, then we should at least acknowledge that women are toxic as well. But for some reason, we're afraid to say things like this because we're afraid that we're going to get canceled or someone calls us. In other words, someone's going to call us names. Banned. The problem is we're not going to get anywhere as long as we're afraid of being called names. I mean, I don't know. I went to school, in elementary school, they used to always tell us, if someone calls you a name, so what? But for some reason today, we think it's a death sentence until someone calls us a name.
Because it's stuck with you. Because it's basically like stuck.
But that kind of goes back to exactly what she's saying here. If you don't have the truth, if you don't tell the truth about yourself, in other words, if you're a man and you're toxic, first of all, you got to figure out what the hell that means in the first place. Well, then you certainly can't tell the truth about the other side and talk about women being toxic as well. And if you're a woman and you're complaining about the other side being toxic, but you can't understand how you also can be toxic in your femininity, then you can't tell the truth about the other side because we're so wrapped up in telling the truth about the other side that now, as I began by saying, we have to almost cover that up with some kind of a worldview. In other words, as soon as I adopt this view that that side is horrible and terrible, well, now I have to kind of adopt the view that my side is pure and perfect. And we'll even say things like, I mean, we're not perfect, but whenever someone says that, I like to stop and go, great, what are some of your flaws? Well, I don't, because people will say that as like a cover. Oftentimes they don't really mean that. They just say that because you're supposed to say that because it's false humility. It's like when someone says, that's not funny. Great, you're an expert in comedy, then tell me something that is funny. You probably can't. If you can't tell me if someone says, well, I'm not perfect, great, tell me in what ways you're not perfect. Give me some of your self-criticism. Give me some of that self-awareness, like Dave was saying earlier.
I was about to say.
But it's difficult to do, especially in the heat of that argument, because then you have to humble yourself. But then you have to ask yourself, what's the point of the argument? Is the point of the argument to win? And then, God, whatever the hell that means. Have you ever won an argument with someone you love?
That's a lose.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lose. Even if you win, you still lose. But if you have the ability to, in the heat of the moment, to stop yourself and figure out, are we arguing because we want to come to some kind of a resolution? Or are we arguing just because we're pissed at each other and we want to fight?
Oh, surprise.
If that's the case, then understand that whatever you do from here forward is just a bunch of shit you're going to have to apologize for later. Or feel bad. And by the way, everything from there forward is probably stuff that's damaging the relationship. So if you can't stop and be humble in the moment, then maybe the problem is there's too much pride that's involved. Going over. There's a healthy level of pride. Remember from Aristotle that we should be feeling. You don't want to have too little so you think everything is your fault. You don't want to have too much to the point that you think the other person is always wrong. You want to have a good amount in the middle to recognize that you might be right, you might be wrong, but the problem that you and this person are facing, you should see them as a problem that's outside of you. And then that way you can come together like a persona and a shadow, and then you can attack the problem rather than attacking each other. Or you can just tear each other apart and fuck it, right?
Sounds like a divorce to me.
That's what it's going to be.
Oh.
Who's the kids? The kids! They say.
Oh, no. I just said, who is this your fight with?
Myself. It's the worst fight you can have.
Mentality.
The worst fight that you can have. But you get the idea here, hopefully. If you don't tell the truth, and by the way, notice how she's not saying, like, you can't. Like, Peter, you can't tell the truth. You can't. No. The idea here is that you do know the truth about yourself. You do not tell the truth about yourself, and you can't tell other people. But first things first, you have to tell it about yourself. First off, you have to know what the truth is, and that sometimes is difficult to get through, because when I ask that question of like, are you trying to win an argument, or are you trying to get to some resolution? Sometimes people will confuse those two things and say, well, it's the same thing, right? No, it's not the same thing at all. It's not the same thing at all. Can you be right without the other person acknowledging it? Like, there are some people who just don't take yes for an answer. You can tell them, I agree with you, and they'll still attack you.
Oh yeah.
It was a very long time ago. I was watching. Actually become more patient. That's good. You guys make me a better person. So at least there's some value in this class.
I mean, you're honest. You're telling the truth.
The truth about myself.
Yeah.
It was years ago, but I remember seeing this episode of Judge Judy one time. I don't. Yeah, long story. Yeah, long story. Anyway, I don't remember what they were fighting about, but there was a woman and a guy, and it went something along the lines of this. She asked the guy, so when did you guys break up? And he said, I think it was summer of, I don't know, we'll say 2006, summer of 2006. And then the woman interrupted, that's not true, that's a lie. He's lying, Your Honor.
That is a fact.
And so the judge says, quiet, madam. And he continues, he says they broke up in summer of 2006. And the woman interrupts again and says, he's lying, we broke up in August.
Of what?
2006.
Yeah.
So then she stops and she says, madam, August is in summer. And she goes, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, I'm sorry. In other words, this is a person, can you imagine being in a relationship with this person, that you can say something that's true, and this person doesn't care what you have to say, what they want to do is fight with you and win the argument. Now this is a person who, there's something wrong, you might think like, oh my God, what's wrong with this person? Keep in mind, that even if you break up with this person still has to live with themselves. So the solution, yeah, you need to get away from people like this. However, understand that that person never gets away from themselves. And that's going to now color everything that they see in the world. This is a person who will drive through the parking lot at Walmart and will get pissed off at people being so stupid for like walking through a parking lot. In other words, everything is somebody else's fault.
Judgmental.
Yeah, the machines don't work. It's not because you're pressing the wrong buttons, right? It's not because you put the credit card in backwards, right? It's because the machine is stupid, not you. Everything else is always, and this is the person who's incapable of telling the truth about themselves. What she's talking about here is this is the person who's capable, you know the truth, and yet if you still refuse to do it, well then you can't tell the truth about other people as well, because other people are going to be in relation to ourselves, if this makes sense. Whenever I say to you guys, how I say it to you also is going to have an impact. One of those frustrating things is I'll say something to a class and then I'll talk to a few students afterwards, and they'll have gotten completely different messages out of what I said. And when I said, like I told the joke, it was this class, right? I told a joke.
You tell a lot of jokes.
But there's one specific.
There's a lot of.
I talk about dark humor, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly.
Is
Oh,
the
that.
Miss Gavin
There'll be
being there?
people, yeah, there'll be people who will hear that joke, and what they'll get from that is Scallon's making fun of kids with cancer. Yeah, but it's more than that. There'll be people who will hear what I just said and say, see, he is making fun of kids with cancer. Of course I'm not. There will be people who will hear the joke and they'll understand the point of the joke. And then there will be people who won't see it one way or the other. They'll just laugh at it. And then there will be people who won't get the joke. And then there will be people who, in other words, there will be all kinds of different interpretations of it.
Yeah, there's a
I can't do anything about that. What I can do is tell the truth about myself, tell the truth about the world as best as I possibly can. And then let those interpretations fall as they fall.
Yeah.
Possibility.
So,
questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques? Anybody know anything about Virginia Woolf?
No.
It's so interesting. Sometimes I have classes where like almost all the hands go up because she died in a very famous way.
how?
Well, I asked. Well, there's also a funny thing. I'll say something like that. She died in a very famous way. Anybody hear about it? No. Maybe it's not so famous then.
It's infamous.
It was infamous. She wrote. Oh my God.
Did she die from
Whenever
poison?
you're in a sad mood, don't Google her. She committed suicide.
Oh.
And she committed suicide
Like Marilyn Monroe?
No, she actually had some dignity in class. And she was a real writer. She and had talent beyond just appearances. But she took rocks and she stuffed them into her pockets and she walked off into the river and she drowned herself. She didn't just jump in the water and say goodbye, cruel world. She jammed rocks in her pockets to help weigh herself down.
Goodbye, cool
Yeah.
world.
She gave herself concrete feet. She gave herself concrete feet.
Yeah, she gave herself concrete feet. Yeah, it's about mob.
Guess I did rock her world.
That actually might be the best thing you said so far.
I think so, yeah.
I knew if I gave him enough time, something.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for it.
But the thing about it, she wrote, again, the reason I say not to Google it from the second was if she wrote one of the most heartbreaking suicide letters you'll ever read in your life.
Oh, it's better than
She writes to her husband. She went through a period of schizophrenia, it seems. That's what we probably think it was. And then she came out of it, and then she felt herself going back into it. So essentially, she writes a letter to her husband, a very loving letter. It isn't like the world has been so cruel to me. It's nothing like that. She says something to the effect of, I find myself falling back into the madness, and I fear we won't survive it this time. We, not just me, not just you. And so she's doing this because she wants to spare him, because he took care of her the whole time that she was suffering from this. She was trying to spare him the suffering of having to take care of her if she fell back into the madness. And in her mind, of course, is she ever going to come back out of it? Who knows? And so it was out of a deep love for her husband that she did this. Now, of course, do you think if you ask her husband, do you think he would sit there and say, for the best?
Well, I tried.
Do you think he's glad that she would commit? No. If you ask her husband, would you rather have her with you, even in the madness? Or would you rather have her dead? Of course he would choose to have her with the madness. But she took that choice away from him by taking it herself. It's an ironic thing that people who do that would think either one of two things. Either like, I'm so angry at the world, I'm going to kill myself. Well, if you're angry at the world, do you think the world's going to care? And if so, in other words, if you're angry at the world because you think the world doesn't care, then why would you do it if you think the world doesn't care? Because we're not thinking rationally. Or because we want to spare loved ones. But of course, you're not sparing loved ones. You're making things infinitely worse. You're leaving a very deep hole. You're
making me feel like it's their fault. You're giving the reason to regret.
Yeah, and that's what happens. The people who don't care about you are gonna go, and they're gonna make jokes and send memes about you.
Yeah.
And then the people who do care about you, you're condemning them to a lifetime of wondering, what could I have done? Why didn't I? And of guilt and self-blame. So there is no positivity to it in either direction. By the way, I know lots of people who have done this. I've had students who have done this. It's one of the reasons I hate that. Have you guys seen that show, 13 Reasons Why?
No.
I've heard about it.
Yeah.
Never
It's
watched
a terrible thing. It's about a girl who commits suicide, but in short, it sends this really awful message, which essentially, so she commits suicide and she leaves these tapes explaining why she did it, condemning people. I did it because of you. I did it because of you. And then throughout the show, she gets to appear in ghostly form and see the effect that it has. In real life, you don't get to do that. You don't get to walk around in ghostly form and see what happens. In real life, once you do it, you're gone, and you leave a deep hole. The people who don't care about you are justified in their belief. See, we knew there was something wrong with them. The people who love you, of course, are left with this deep hole of, God, why didn't I see it? Why didn't I do something?
Yeah.
There's no positive, there's no outcome.
It brings
like
one more.
A friend of mine committed suicide that way. She was inside of a bathroom, and her boyfriend was outside the bathroom. I knew both of them. And she was inside, and essentially he broke up with her. And then he's telling her, I love you, but there was just problems here, like long story. And then he said to her, I love you. And she's like, you love me? And he said, I do. I love you very much. I love you very much. And then she shot herself. Like she was just waiting for that last bit of affirmation. Now, what do you think his life is like?
Horrible.
Right. And then, of course, as he's sitting there, he's like crying because he hears the gunshot go off, and he fidgets, and then the door opens. She locked herself inside the bathroom. He has no idea why didn't the knob turn earlier? If the knob had turned earlier, he could have saved her life, right? Well, did he try? I don't know. Who knows? Because when you're in that grief and that panic, maybe he forced the door open, doesn't remember. Maybe he never tried to open the door, but he's now left with that grief in his life. The rest of his life, why didn't I just turn the knob? Of course, that wasn't going to save her life ultimately, but in his mind now, that one person she cared about in the world is carrying that grief around with him for the rest of his life. And I talked to him maybe a month ago, and this happened
recent.
6 years ago, 5, 6 years ago. and
Oh.
he still carries this with him every day and hasn't been able to move on with anything in his life.
I'm pretty sure like right in that moment, I felt like he was feeling a bit hesitant on the situation. Like his kind of figure out something, but he really couldn't think about what to do. But I think he could have done this, but at that moment, they were feeling mixed feelings about something. Like it's good and positive. It's really like you said before, like with the person like, oh, I'm a comedian. We'll say a joke, and then they're just left on the spot, and they couldn't really say much about anything at that moment. That's the thing.
Yeah. And by the way,